This video will explain to you how to identify and prevent a series of errors categorized as sentence boundary errors. There are three types of sentence boundary errors: the comma splice, the fused sentence, and the sentence fragment. We will define each type of error, go over some example sentences, and suggest ways to fix these errors. When you hear the word boundary, you may think of this, or even this, and in a sense, you would be correct. When we write, we use punctuation to create boundaries between our ideas, to establish where our sentences begin and end. Think of a typical paper. Now imagine if all the punctuation were removed from the same paper. The ideas would blur together, the phrasing would become confusing, and the reader would have problems making sense of the paper. Sentence boundary errors are so named because the root of the problem has to do with the way we use punctuation to define the boundaries of the sentence. Of course, not all types of punctuation have the same usage. For example, we can only end a sentence with a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, though we might use other types of punctuation, such as colons or commas, to separate clauses within a sentence. Before we proceed, we should also define two key terms. In order to identify and fix sentence boundary errors, you need to know how to tell the difference between an independent and a dependent clause. An independent clause makes sense by itself, it can stand by itself. A dependent clause, on the other hand, is dependent on the rest of the sentence. It is an incomplete thought that cannot stand on its own. Let's continue with the idea of sentence boundary errors and add a little visual of the different types of errors. Think of a modern suburban neighborhood made up of house after house, each with its own lawn. Each house represents a complete sentence or independent clause. Let's also add fences around each house's yard. Think of punctuation as fences or boundaries, and remember that different types of punctuation have different jobs. A period is a very strong, tall privacy fence. Other types of punctuation, like a semicolon or comma, are not quite as strong. Perhaps a comma is more like small decorative edging, or a little bit of chicken wire. Ideally, we'll have the proper punctuation around our sentences. In visual terms, think of this as houses separated neatly by strong fences. The problem occurs when we put these boundaries in the wrong places. So let's start with the comma splice. The comma splice is probably the least familiar of the three sentence boundary errors, but it's an extremely common error. A comma splice is made up of two independent clauses separated only by a comma. A comma splice then occurs when the writer tries to separate two independent clauses using only a short little fence, too puny to do any good. This punctuation is not sufficient between the independent clauses, and there are three main ways that we can fix the error. Change the comma to a period, change the comma to a semicolon, or leave the comma and add a coordinating conjunction. Let's look at our example sentence, now revised, using the three methods. The second type of sentence boundary error is the fused sentence. A fused sentence is two independent clauses with no punctuation between them. Does that sound familiar? It should, because a fused sentence is very similar to a comma splice. The only difference is that a comma splice contains a comma between the independent clauses, and a fused sentence has no punctuation between the independent clauses. Now, here's an example. If I say this sentence as it's written, I love strawberries, strawberry pie is my favorite. Not only will you think that I'm a crazy strawberry lady, you'll probably be a little confused. In fact, most of us wouldn't say the sentence as it's written. We would pause naturally after strawberries, because we recognize that this is the end of the first independent clause. Visually, if we use our analogy of independent clauses being like houses, a fused sentence is two houses or more with no fence or punctuation between them. Now, the good news is that we can fix a fused sentence using the same techniques that we use to fix a comma splice. Adding a period between the independent clauses, adding a semicolon between the independent clauses, adding a comma and a coordinating conjunction between the independent clauses, or turning one of the independent clauses into a dependent clause. Let's apply these fixes to our sample sentence. Easy, right? The last sentence boundary error is a sentence fragment. Comma splices and fused sentences are created with two independent clauses, but sentence fragments do not even have one independent clause. A sentence fragment is a dependent or subordinate clause, an incomplete thought that cannot stand on its own. If we look at our last example and you read the two sentences separately, you'll quickly be able to detect the sentence fragment. While Robert collects rare books makes sense on its own and is thus an independent clause, you would be pretty confused if I blurted out, often first editions are signed copies, because this is a dependent clause that doesn't make sense on its own. If we continue with our analogy of houses and fences, a sentence fragment is like cutting right through the middle of a house. The punctuation is in the wrong place. We fix a sentence fragment by either connecting it to an existing independent clause or turning it into an independent clause. When we look at the example sentence, we can see another truth about fragments. Often the fragment is related to the sentence right before or right after it, so you can fix the fragment by simply removing the period and connecting the fragment to that independent clause. Your other option is to change the fragment from a dependent to an independent clause. And don't forget that you can be creative in how you reword the sentence. So, just to review, comma splices are two independent clauses separated by just a comma. Fused sentences are two independent clauses with no punctuation between them, and sentence fragments are dependent clauses. Also, never forget the demolition option. If you simply can't figure out how to fix a sentence boundary error, just delete the sentence, wait a few minutes, and then rewrite it.